I now will give the floor to Professor Vellinga, and we are very much looking forward to hear about the water problem, because the water has not been dealt in the previous session and is such an important issue, climate change for Venice, as Professor Vellinga will show us. Now I give the floor to Pier Vellinga, please.
Yes, indeed. I will be happy to talk about my view on my experience with Venice Lagoon and the city of Venice. And I hope there we are. Storytelling is important, I was told, and it was said by Bonnie earlier yesterday. The narrative is important. And I'd like to start with a narrative that has a long history, already 17th, 16th century. This is Venice. And this has to do with this annual ceremony at Ascension Day, where the Doge goes out on the Bucintoro and he has a ring. And the ring he throws in the lagoon as a symbol to marry the lagoon. So the city marries the lagoon every year again. And they, of course, they have a big party afterwards. But of course, this symbolizes what we're discussing today and what I will present today as well, the strong interconnectedness of the historic city and the lagoon. This is the story about the Bucintera. You can find it anywhere. This is the lagoon we discuss and the city. And, well, the sea level is rising. And of course, the city of Venice has been sinking from its very start. It was marshland here. They were building first huts and then palaces, whatever, and it's on marshland, so it was sinking a little bit, but because the Istrian stone that was used, which was impermeable, the buildings did not really suffer. Until a few centuries and building and rebuilding and conserving the city, the sea level rise more or less kept up, which is a phenomena, you know, it's eustatic processes, so long-term tectonic processes, some natural subsidence because the weight of the buildings and the peatland, and at a certain time, some human-induced subsidence because of groundwater withdrawal. And you can see that very well on this picture. You see this trend, you know, by year it changes a little bit, but there is a trend from left to right of a rising average level of the sea. Then you see some acceleration in the late 60s, which is because of the groundwater withdrawal for industry at Marghera. And then they discovered this acceleration of sea level rise, and qua governance, they were capable in stopping it and finding alternative ways to produce the water. There was a little bit of a rebound, but since then it has continued, and also an increased frequency of flooding. So of course this is a familiar sight then. It was maybe once every year. Now it could happen in the weeks to come. But there is more to that. It's not just the historic building. Also the lagoon is suffering, and it's to some extent turning into sea because it's a bit artificial with all its jetties. With the high tide, some clean water is coming in, and this clean water, under the forces of the wind and the waves, is mixing with the sediment, and then some more sediment-laden water is going out again. So the lagoon is not really natural, but it's exporting sediment. And, well, we've been advising often to add some sediment again. Well, there are still discussions going on about that. Anyway, here on the top picture, you see the profile as it was originally, say a few hundred years ago. And on the bottom, you see the present profile. So many less islands and marshland, which of course changes the ecosystem and makes it less unique. I mean, the uniqueness is this intertidal area where you have all these migrating birds and unique ecosystems. So something has to be done, and especially after the '66 flood. And, well, I think it was good governance. They made a special law in '73, And not just to protect the city against high water, but also to prevent further environmental degradation and habitat loss and urban restoration. So it was a holistic approach at that time, and a good structure with a private consortium, which is in itself not necessarily bad, local authorities, and a local company called Insula. And this consortium would do the sea defenses, and the Insula would meanwhile raise the pavements in the city and do urban restoration. And there was a comitatone of mixed ministers and mayors of the city, representatives of the province, to supervise all of that. And they totally had a budget in the order of 16 billion euro. It was already then known this was going to cost a lot of money, but it would be cleaning, urban restoration, and coastal defense in a kind of balanced approach. And indeed the work started, and you may think that this Mose was the most costly thing, but that's not true. It was 4.5 billion, a lot of money, but in a little while I'll show the budget went to urban restoration. It was a little more, because this coastal defense you can do with some big engineering measures, but the urban restoration is really fine arts work with architects and the pavements, and you can only raise it this much because then otherwise you destruct the whole buildings in its architecture. So there were local defenses, and if you walk through Venice, you will see that as an architect, you probably could notice that many of the sills of the main floor are elevated a little bit, or not, and you have steps all over. But it was a major effort to elevate all the pavements to about 1.10 meters above mean sea level, while originally they would be at plus 60 centimeters or plus 80 centimeters. So lots has been invested in pavement and urban restoration. And of course, these are the big works, the most, and I'll go more deeper into it. At the 3 entrances, storm surge barriers were built, very sophisticated type, and I'll come to that in a minute. This is the type. And, it's actually, you could use many different techniques to protect a lagoon and a city from the outside waters, be it the Atlantic, the North Sea, and much is going on in many coastal cities to protect the cities like New Orleans, like New York, like Chinese cities, like Jakarta. But the Venetians would like to keep an open entrance to the port, and the citizens would like to keep a completely open view from the city or to the sea. So which required lots of creativity, and in the end this was chosen. It's a set of doors laying on the floor, hollow, full of water, but the water can be pumped out by air, and then they start floating, and by floating they can overcome about 2 meter tidal difference between the Adriatic and the lagoon. But it's not just these bottom doors, but it's also a lot of protection for the ships to come in at Malamocco, for the fisheries at Chioggia to go in and out. So when this solution came up, everyone pitched in and wanted a little bit. The port authorities wanted about the biggest lock to be able to grow. The fishermen at Chioggia were not satisfied with 1 lock, they needed 2 locks. And this is indeed what happens if you have a national fund, everyone wants a little bit in there. But anyway, this was a company, Technital, in Milan, that was aware of its high strategic and prestigious value. And they did tests at MIT in Boston, at Delft Hydraulics, where I was working 35 years ago. They were doing tests in Denmark and at Padua. So they tested this solution in 4 different laboratories and came out that it can work. And they optimized it, etc. So I think it's one of the most sophisticated coastal engineering works of the world. Of course, it's disputed, and I'll discuss that in a minute as well. The investment In the morphological reconstruction, so the marshland, was another 700 million. Pollution, reducing chemical pollutants from Marghera, but also reducing agricultural pollutants. We had a big investment of 3.5 billion. And the lagoon is now much cleaner than it was 30 years ago. You can go swimming in it again. And then it was absolutely impossible 30 years ago. And then the buildings, this urban restoration took the biggest share out of the special law. And I guess rightfully so. And in the end, this balance was chosen between heightening the pavements to what you can architecturally accept, and then a storm surge barrier for the real high water. They also invested a lot in research and science, like some 400 million over the last 20, 30 years. But of course, this triggered a lot, the '66 storm. And I would like to take you back to that period. So what to do after this storm? And there were a lot of solutions discussed, and each of them had its trade-offs. And I remember my professor at Delft was engaged already in the '60s to discuss with Venetian and Italian authorities what to do. And the issue on the table was then, why not make a polder? A polder, is an area where you control the water, making a small dam between Palestrina and the mainland, and keeping the shipping lanes free, and make a semi-enclosed sea or enclosed sea for Venice, which would have been by far the cheapest solution. And you could either choose for a freshwater Venice or a saltwater Venice. Saltwater would be better because the sewage system, completely goes on the tide. So you need the tide to clean the city. And then you would only have to manage this part of the lagoon, and you could leave the other parts of the lagoon completely open. But, for historic and cultural reasons, it was unacceptable to split the lagoon into two basins. So it had to be one solution. So this idea of a polder was out. Then the next one is, well, if you want to maintain the lagoon, you can close it off completely, but then it would go in fresh water, and, well, that was not acceptable. Then you could use the typical solutions like this one in the Netherlands. Well, I must honestly say, and I believe you're right, the Italians found it too ugly. I mean, it may be impressive and it works, but it's rather tough engineering work. And in fact, this was not the solution. We want a Ferrari on the seafloor. Well, you can always find, if you have a budget, you can always find engineers who help you to build a Ferrari on the seafloor. Of course, it's a bit vulnerable, but I think it will work. I'll come to that in a minute. So, and of course, internationally, there are different types of solutions. Here you see one of the early ones in the Netherlands on the far left, then a recent one in the Netherlands. You see the Thames barrier. You see then another barrier in Rotterdam, which is already a little more elegant. When it's open, you don't see it. And then you see a rubber tube solution, which was also tested for Venice. Pirelli in the 80s had this major plan to have a tube across all these entrances. But of course, in the end, this Moses survived as being the most elegant and the most reliable solution. Why reliable? Because it consists of 85 independently steerable doors. And the problem always is with complex systems that if you depend on one failure, could lose it all. And here even 1 or 2 or 3 door failures are acceptable, and it still would keep most of the water out. So it's intellectually quite a good solution. Here I show you also New York after Sandy. They really discussed what to do, and Dutch engineers helped them to find solutions. And this is one to make a barrier between Staten Island and Brooklyn, or maybe here one to close off the whole barrier. And of course the alternative, just to raise the pavement in New York. And finally this has been chosen, but in combination with making the seafront much prettier, greener, etc. I think a good solution for the time being, And at least you can postpone floods for another 30 years, but it'll come back. This was refused then by the New York. They rather change the waterfront. It'd be more costly, but probably from an urban planner's point of view, you have more benefits by much more better using the seafront and raising it a little bit. And of course, New York had lesser problems with historic constraints, monument constraints. But in the meantime, you know, this was all started because of the flood. In '66, the issue of sea level rise was not on the agenda yet. It only came on the agenda in the early '80s. But in retrospect, you could say, well, the solution for Venice is also an interesting solution for dealing with future sea level rise, because it's coming. And this summer we will get new academic reports on the accelerated melting of Antarctica. It's going even faster than the most recent IPCC report. So we're still in for considerable sea level rise, even if the Paris Agreement will be kept. Even if global temperatures go up 2 degrees, probably sea level rise will go on for a few ages at a level of 50 centimeters to 1 meter per 100 years. So lots to come still. And here we see on the horizontal axis it's time, you know, from 1880 to now. And the vertical axis you see millimeters of sea level rise. And well, say some 50 years ago, this was going at 2 millimeters per year. And right now, the global average has increased to about 3.5, 4 millimeters per year. We don't feel it yet in the Mediterranean. We don't even feel it yet in the North Sea. But here I have a graph. People in Florida see it already much better. And some of the islands in the South China Sea, it already better. And all our measurement stations add up to this 4 millimeter. Some have more, and we still have relatively less. But it's coming, and it will, I mean, the ocean is not one flat thing. It's a bit mountainous as well for lots of geological reasons. So sea level rise goes with pulses. It's slow maybe, and then it goes a bit faster. And of course, we also see the signal of increased losses in coastal areas like Sandy and Katarina, but also in the third world, the damage is going up. But what about the Mediterranean? The Mediterranean is extremely complex. You could say when the Atlantic rises, and it is rising, and it's accelerating a bit, then the Mediterranean will have to rise as well. And it will. But the Mediterranean, of course, is a little bit lower than the Atlantic because it's more salty. So it is more weighty, so salt water is heavier and it pushes against the fresh water in the Strait of Gibraltar and balancing the two. But if we have more evaporation in the Mediterranean, it may become a little bit salter, so even balancing a little more. And at some places it's very deep, 3, 4 more kilometers. At some places it's shallow. So there are still quite a few questions about sea level rise in the Mediterranean. It's not straightforward. Like the impact in the salinity will have an influence, evaporation, and precipitation. And of course the mass balance exchange between Gibraltar and the Mediterranean is complex. We're pretty certain it will rise together with the Atlantic, but it might be a little slower. And we drew a group of international experts, I was one of them, was here in Venice, making scenarios for Venice. But it became quite complex. So we came up anywhere between 70 centimeter and even a minus, so it could even not rise so quickly. So that's the big range. And of course, over time, more knowledge will be there. But it's pretty certain, the best guess, it will rise at an average of or up to about 50 centimeters or more in the next century. And by Mose, and I assume we will finish it, I mean 90% of the budget has been invested. When Mose is ready, by 2018 or maybe 2019, then you can keep your bottle, but it should be ready. And by then, Venice and its lagoon are more ready for climate change than, I would say, any other coastal city in the world. Because New York may be ready for 30 centimeters, the Netherlands may be ready for 20, 30 centimeters, and we plan a kind of adaptive planning. But in one go, with Mose, Venice and the hinterland would be ready for 60 centimeters. So that's not bad. And of course, this is my engineering view. I think it will work, and I believe Italians will finish it. So what is my recommendation for the future of Venice? And of course, I'm an engineer and not an expert in many other things, but I have participated in many future scenario exercises. And I would say, well, Mose can protect the city for at least 60 to 100 years. But of course, the growing number of visitors may be a bigger problem for the next 10 to 20 years. So my personal advice is indeed, you need new arrangements with regulated flows of tourists. Well, this was discussed. Maybe disperse tourists. I read today in the news that yesterday the Amsterdam government decided to replace the cruise terminal to a little bit outside the city to disperse the visitors, to spread them around in the larger area instead of just Amsterdam. But anyway, so regulated flows of tourists and housing policies. And I think those are the things that came up here. And for low income, including students, but also startups, and they will be required, in my perception. And in terms of a parallel economy to the tourists, don't look into additional economic sectors, such as water or ICT SEC, but build on these historic capabilities that would make use of the tourist flows, such as crafts, indeed, as you were promoting, design, art, but also cooking, and food, in combination with training in these fields. And look for ways to integrate, I would say, the natural uniqueness, the lagoon, the historic uniqueness, and the cultural uniqueness. And indeed, build on these historic capabilities also of the local and regional population. Make use of the tourist flows, crafts, design, etc. And integrate and cherish the uniqueness. And combine natural with ecological diversity. And I'll come to one of the World Heritages in the Netherlands as well, where this is now the main goal, to combine natural and cultural diversity. Explore and develop, this concept of shared interest groups, stakeholders, and not top-down, but participatory. I don't think we can do much anymore in this information age if it's not participatory with those people involved. And we've been accused too often of thinking for the people instead of with the people that have to work with it. But, before I close, because this is my recommendations for Venice, I think we should be aware that the world is entering in a whole new cycle of development. I recently worked together with the London School of Economics, Carlotta Perez, professor, for the EU, what would bring the EU prosperity and jobs. So we did a trend analysis, and we concluded on the basis of data that new lifestyles are emerging with more attention to personal health. And if I look at all of you, I think we all spend much more attention to personal health than our parents. We pay more for staying healthy, for food, whatever, and for the ecological surround us. So, you can test it. It may be now the intellectual elite doing that, but Carlotta Perez made a strong point that this will be followed. We will entering an age with new lifestyles, with more personal health, but also more attention for planetary health. And of course, this may be wishful thinking, but we see signs of it, that we're indeed moving towards an economy less material and more services oriented. you know, and much more personalized products and services than material products and services. And we are willing to pay for software packages more than maybe for material goods. And this is the evidence of statistics. You know, the bottom blue line is employment growth over the last 15 years of the overall European economy. The dotted blue line is the growth of employment. Then the red line is the economic growth of those companies selling products that are environmentally more conscious or health more conscious. And the dotted line is the growth of employment of companies that are fully tuned to sustainability. So it's a fact now that companies that work according to the norms of sustainability make more profit and grow faster in terms of employment. And this is happening. So if we make the future, if we advise on the future of Venice, we should take these things into account. And, well, I'm not necessarily a Kondratiev addict, but it's always interesting to show this one. You know, history has shown cycles of development often driven by new technologies. And since we are now in a post-industrialized, post-standardization and much more personal, it looks like we could enter a new phase again with renewable energies, with water recycling and reuse, with more healthy food again, which is not standardized, but which is more personalized, maybe more local, more traceable, etc. And, well, economists with some technical background can figure out that in the end, the world would be better off with more decentralized systems, and they would be, in the end, be cheaper. It will not be easy to make this transformation because we will have many stranded assets, but it's interesting to take note of it when we consider the future. Finally, I'm engaged in a World Heritage of UNESCO, which is a natural heritage. But by working there, we cannot escape from the cultural heritage. And we realize in this heritage that you have to integrate the two. These are old Hanseatic cities on the shores here of the north of the Netherlands. And what you're seeing is the north of the Netherlands, part of Germany and Denmark, this Wadden Sea, which is part of the North Sea. And you see all these islands, and then you see the lagoons behind it, the open system. And it's a UNESCO World Heritage, and I'm on a group of scientists that fully devoted to integrate the local economy into the local ecology. And this is what I think is now happening in the modern thinking about nature conservation. It's about sustainability and diversity. We are celebrating diversity and try to combine the cultural diversity, the local diversity, you know, including fanfare, carnival, what have you, with the natural diversity. And trying to reinvent the word community, local communities. We're now thinking not in antagonistic terms, like has happened so many years in environmental protection. You know, we intensify agriculture to make money, to reserve more space for nature. And I think we've come at the end of that paradigm. And we now realize we have to integrate food production and agriculture into nature and make it inherently sound. And there are important groups now like Common Land who are working on big natural parks of, say, 100,000 hectares, where farming and food production is more sustainable. And I would like to close with the statement, you know, we should build an economy that is based on existing unique assets of cultural and natural assets, and build on the historic capabilities of the population and the crafts and the food. And I think that would be my recommendation also to look at the future of its lagoon and Venice. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation, and it was very interesting to hear about the MOSE and the idea that MOSE will protect Venice for many years to come after it's finished. Now we